Authoritarianism. You know, those uptight, military-obsessed governments with a penchant for world domination and synchronized high-stepping? I never understood that, by the way. Is that supposed to be intimidating? As a child, my exposure to authoritarianism was limited to stock villains and sci-fis and action movies, a handful of rogue dictatorships in other parts of the world, and a few horrible tragedies that happened in the distant past. All safely separated from myself by time and space and the fact that movies and TV are not the same as real life. Well, some of the time. Authoritarianism, I presumed, was an evil that had mostly been eradicated, and 'twas only a matter of time for the rest of the world to modernize and embrace freedom and democracy. And then this happened. Seriously, what the f? Okay, yes, there was a lot of other stuff leading up to this insanity, but a run-through of events and political shifts that culminated in the ugly and stupid attack on the US Capitol is not what this video is about. Nor am I going to try to convince you that Trumpism or MAGAism or whatever you want to call it represents a clear threat to American democracy. If you haven't clicked away from this video yet, I'm guessing you're at least open to the concept. The point is, authoritarianism is not just a problem of the distant past or a small handful of rogue dictatorships. My country, the old US of A, powerful though it may be, is not special and not immune to the destructive forces that have toppled democracies in the past. Of course, Trump is just one dirty sock in the authoritarianism laundry bin. From Xi Jinping incrementally becoming president for life in China to the restriction of press freedoms in Turkey, authoritarianism is on the rise all over the world. According to VDEM Institute's annual democracy report, the world now has more closed autocracies than open democracies for the first time in over 2 decades. And by 2022, 72% of the world's population lived in autocracies, up from 46% in 2012. That's a big difference. And many of these governments that are now considered authoritarian were actually put in power by the will of the people through legitimate democratic elections. So where does this support come from? Why do people who live in modern societies with mostly stable economies and open access to the entirety of human knowledge supportive of governments who are known for deceit, oppression, and violence? And what is it that drives people to participate in this violence? Is it our hyperpolarized society? Are they bored? Are they compensating for something? In this video, I'm going to look at authoritarianism, how it presents itself, the cultural and psychological conditions that allow it to flourish, why it's on the rise, and if there's anything we could do about it. So yeah, grab a snack, get comfy. This is some serious shit. Parking a tank at the steps of Congress, blocking access to Wikipedia, destroying an entire planet with a giant space laser. While the tactics of authoritarian governments differ, they do share some key similarities: the accumulation of power in the hands of a small number of people, the rejection of anything that challenges the status quo, and the tendency to see laws and government institutions as malleable and less about protecting the rights of citizens and more about helping those in power stay in power. So less justice is blind and balanced and more like justice is my bitch and I'ma do what I want. And of course, sometimes the willingness to use deception, coercion, and violence to achieve their goals. Authoritarian governments could be ruled by a single person making all the decisions, like a dictator or a king. They could be under military control or single party control. There are various ways of categorizing the different types of authoritarian governments. Every author has their own opinions on this, but they're all variations on the same basic principle: a large amount of power being held by a small number of people, and that power must be maintained at all costs. Sure, you may not be part of a targeted ethnic minority, but under an authoritarian government, every free thinker is a potential threat to the regime. All it takes is commenting on the wrong social media post or having one of your neighbors overhear you insult the president, and you can wind up in jail or worse. Authoritarian governments are notorious for imprisoning journalists, human rights abuses, denying basic freedoms, and monumental f***ups. Not to mention completely ruining the reputation of the toothbrush mustache. I mean, come on, like a whole style of facial hair gone forever because of one asshole. Y'all know who I'm talking about. Authoritarianism is often contrasted with democracy, where in its ideal form is government by the people, for the people, with the people, next to the... Anyway, there's a lot of people involved, and that's the point. Power is distributed, like a nice even layer of mayo on a turkey sandwich. Unlike authoritarianism, which is more like having one big concentrated blob in one spot. In a democracy, the ultimate source of political power lies with the people, and they exercise this power through elections. These days, authoritarian governments will often try to maintain the appearance of a democracy while secretly, or not so secretly, manipulating things behind the scenes. They've changed a lot since their high-stepping military days. With a few notable exceptions, of course, the whole conquering the world thing and ruling with an iron fist is not really in style anymore. Authoritarians will often hold elections, for example, even though those elections might be predetermined, and they'll allow opposition parties to exist, but keep them confined to the margins by controlling the media outlets. Of course, the reality is a bit more nuanced than you're either democratic or you're authoritarian. It's the spectrum from fully democratic on one end to closed autocracies and dictatorships on the other. So in other words, on a scale of Sweden to North Korea. Location along the spectrum can change over time as well. When a country starts out democratic but becomes more authoritarian over time, that's called democratic backsliding. And this seems to be a growing trend. According to Freedom House's 2023 Freedom of the World report, the number of countries that have had declines in democracy have outnumbered the countries with improvements every year for the past 17 years. The scary thing about democratic backsliding is it often occurs through legitimate processes and can be so gradual that people don't even know it's happening, like incrementally weakening checks on executive power or limiting voting access to certain groups of people. But without actually saying that you're doing that or enforcing an outright ban. In fact, authoritarians will often intentionally create an environment of ambiguity and confusion to obscure their activities and help consolidate power. Like, for example, creating doubt around an election as cover for trying to overturn said election, or by suppressing opposition by muddying the waters of our media landscape with disinformation, or to quote Steve Bannon, to flood the zone with He said that. They said what their strategy is, just by saying a whole lot of bull. The whole point is to make people feel confused, powerless, and unable to rally support around a common cause. So, what is the current state of authoritarianism then in my home country, the good old USA? How we doing? Well, while far from a perfect democracy, the US still ranks pretty high on the freedom scale. We're still allowed to practice the religion of our choosing, for example, and we're free to express our numerous and colorful opinions on a variety of media platforms. By contrast, in Saudi Arabia, for example, churches are banned. And in Russia, reporting on the truth can get you imprisoned and possibly poisoned. And despite a barrage of false claims of election fraud, we still have free elections in this country. Unlike Belarus, for example, where Alexander Lukashenko won his 6th presidential election in a row with a suspiciously high 81% of the vote. However, despite the US still being mostly free, our democracy score has slipped a bit in the past few years. In their 2023 report, Freedom House gave the United States of America a score of 83 out of 100 in their Freedom Report. Not terrible, but an 11-point drop from our score of 94 back in 2011. A few things that have nudged us back include rising extremism, harmful immigration policies, growing disparities in wealth and influence, and, well, this guy. But just as a country can backslide into authoritarianism, it could also become more democratic. Between the year 2000 and 2017, protests unseated 23% of the authoritarian regimes that fell during that period. Another 43% lost power via elections. So in other words, while they have a reputation for dominance and military might, authoritarian governments are by their nature fragile and require broad support from the public. So what's their angle? Why do so many people devote themselves to a system that essentially takes away their political power? Well, first we have to look at how authoritarianism presents itself and why this message is so gosh darn appealing.
Можно мне вас поцеловать, товарищ Сталин? За все! За все, что вы сделали для нашего народа! Для нас!
For those who have managed to avoid getting sucked in, the classic authoritarianism sales pitch has become predictably obvious at this point and has been used throughout history with a frustratingly high amount of success. 1. Emphasize the superiority and exceptionalism of your nation or group, which can often be accomplished by putting down or derogating a different group. Make people terrified that their lives or their culture are in danger. Blame or demonize an outside group like immigrants or a religious minority, and then claim to be the only one capable of standing up to this danger, restoring order, and ushering in a new era of prosperity. And of course, the person delivering this pitch is usually charismatic, has a large, dedicated, some might say cult-like following, and likes to portray themselves as some sort of infallible strongman or savior. Ring a bell? Does that ring a bell? bell to anyone? This is Trump's and countless other would-be authoritarians' gimmick in a nutshell. Authoritarian movements will rarely, if ever, broadcast their true intentions, promising that if elected president, you'll, for example, steal billions from the state treasury to finance a private army and buy 3,000 pairs of shoes is probably not an effective campaign message, unless you're Trump maybe? I don't know. The great irony of authoritarian movements is that they promise a sense of greatness, but are constantly subverting this goal by making their supporters feel like crap. It's this constant cycle of, you're great, you're wonderful, and then 2 seconds later, you're in danger, your life is shitty, people are trying to get you, but ooh, look over here, there's something shiny and wonderful. It's false promises. Yay! So why does this work? Why are so many people susceptible to fear-mongering and blatant xenophobia and obvious lies? It's tempting to stop the analysis here and say, well, I guess some people are just stupid or misinformed or racist, and then go turn on MSNBC or watch your liberal YouTube channel and then just sort of oscillate between existential dread and spiteful mockery for the rest of your life. Or we can dig a little deeper. Assume that maybe people aren't just stupid. Maybe there's something more fundamental going on. Something on a psychological level that not only draws people into authoritarian movements, but drives them to commit acts of political violence. Well, there is. And it's a problem that shows up more often and in more places than you might expect. In the mid-2000s, social and political psychologist Agnieszka Golec-Desavala was trying to understand the roots of terrorist violence. Not the supposed political or religious rationale, but the social and psychological conditions that draw people towards extreme ideologies and compel them to commit violence for their cause. What she found seemed very similar to something psychologist Erich Fromm described in his 1973 book, The Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, which is an excellent book title. It's called Group or Collective Narcissism. And the more Dr. Golec-Desavala looked, the more she realized that this phenomenon was not just limited to terrorist groups. When we talk about narcissism, we often describe an individual who's obsessed with their self-image, believes that they are superior to others, and as such is entitled to special treatment. This is a pretty common character trope that shows up in movies and TV a lot. Narcissists are often portrayed as vain, manipulative, and lacking in basic empathy. Collective narcissism is similar, except instead of an inflated self-image, an individual exaggerates the positive image and importance of a group that they belong to. Humans are social creatures. Consequently, a lot of psychological conditions that apply to individuals can also be experienced on a group level. You can be proud of your own individual achievements, or you could take pride in the accomplishments of a group you identify with, like your country, your religious group, or your high school football team when they win the big game, even if you were just watching from the sidelines. Because you've extended your personal identity to the larger collective, their accomplishments become your accomplishments. Woohoo! We won the big game! Yay! Of course, this swings both ways. An insult against a group you identify with can sting just as badly as one directed against yourself.
You just got your asses whipped by a bunch of goddamn nerds. Nerds!
This is a good example of collective narcissism from the renowned 1980 film Revenge of the Nerds, which is admittedly a very problematic film, but for our purposes, it's a good example, so just roll with me on this. The jocks believe that they are superior to the nerds, and as such, that they are entitled to special treatment. And when they don't get it, what Dr. Golec-Desavala found in her studies is that the exact same phenomenon that underpins terrorist violence can occur within literally any kind of group that people can belong to. Your college fraternity, your chess club, your surfer gang? I mean, I guess I'd feel entitled too if I was in a 90s surf gang with a Red Hot Chili Pepper. Just watch out for that Swayze roundhouse. And of course, collective narcissism shows up quite a bit when politics are involved. Over the past 2 decades, Golec-Desavala and her colleagues at the Prejudice Lab have studied collective narcissism in different contexts, using something called the collective narcissism scale. In each study, participants are asked to respond to prompts, such as, "My group deserves special treatment," or "The true worth of my group is often misunderstood," on a scale of strongly disagree to strongly agree. And then, depending on the study, they're also asked questions about their specific group affiliations, feelings about themselves, and feelings about certain outgroups. And the results have been very consistent. In Poland, high scores on the collective narcissism scale were found to be positively related to anti-Semitism. It predicts animosity between white and black people in London and negative attitudes towards Arab immigrants in the United States. And as I've said, it's not just related to significant national or racial conflicts. Studies have also been done in the context of academic settings and professional sports fandom, and in both cases have found clear links between aggressive behavior, retaliation, and collective narcissism. And to bring this back to politics, collective narcissism is also linked to voting for Brexit in the UK, and after partisanship, was the strongest predictor of voting for Donald Trump in the 2016 US presidential election. Now, I should say, this is not just limited to conservative politics. You can have collective narcissistic feelings about liberal groups too, or any political party for that matter. And just because it was a strong predictor does not mean that everybody who voted for Donald Trump is a collective narcissist. All these studies are saying is that if you exhibit collective narcissistic behavior, you are more likely to vote for Brexit in the UK or Trump in the US. Okay. So, collective narcissism can be summed up in two parts. One, that your group is exceptional, and two, that your group's exceptionalness is not sufficiently recognized by others. People who experience collective narcissism are in constant need of external validation of their group's status. They are hypersensitive to criticism from outside groups and are prone to perceiving threats where there are none.
What are you looking at, nerd? Huh?
Most critically though, collective narcissism is a powerful predictor of intergroup aggression and hostility. Now, collective narcissism does not always lead to violence. The belief that your favorite quarterback is being mistreated by the press does not automatically mean that you're going to pick up arms and storm the Capitol. There's probably a subreddit or a Twitter thread where that rage can be vented. Oh, excuse me, X. And in more chill social contexts where civility is considered a good thing, individuals who express collective narcissism can be safely relegated to the fringes of the group. The real problem is when the group itself starts embracing and shaping its identity around these beliefs. And this is exactly what authoritarian movements do. They cultivate collective narcissistic animosity towards a common enemy, and then they capitalize on that collective anger and fear by promising to fulfill their supporters' need for special status. Collective narcissistic resentment is fuel for authoritarianism. So where has all this resentment fuel come from? Have power-hungry tyrants just gotten better at exploiting our weaknesses? Is it global warming? Or is there something uniquely problematic about our current moment in history? Well, sometimes when you're trying to understand the problems of today, you gotta dig into the past, because this has all happened before. In an effort to make sense of the horrors of the Holocaust and the rise of the Nazi Party, political philosophy professor and Holocaust survivor Hannah Arendt published this book in 1951, The Origins of Totalitarianism. In the book, Arendt attributes the rise of totalitarianism in the early mid-20th century to a profound loneliness that can be traced back to the Industrial Revolution. In her view, the growth in modern capitalist economies led to a breakdown of traditional communities, leaving people rootless, alienated from one another and society. Families became separated as people moved to cities where manufacturing jobs were concentrated. The economies and populations of small and rural towns dwindled, and traditional forms of social organization like churches became less important in people's lives. Arendt describes loneliness as being closely connected to uprootedness and superfluousness, which has been the curse of modern times since the Industrial Revolution. Uprootedness meaning having no place in the world, and superfluousness as not belonging to the world at all. One of the most radical and desperate experiences of man. Totalitarian regimes, while restrictive and controlling, do offer a sense of purpose and belonging. She noted that terror can only rule over men who are isolated against each other. Hence, one of the primary concerns of totalitarian governments, a government whose essence is terror, is to create this sense of isolation, this superfluousness, whether it's by limiting access to information, surveillance, repression, or fostering an environment of fear and distrust. And we don't have to be alone to be lonely. Arendt notes that loneliness shows itself most sharply in the context of others. Now, loneliness is not the same thing as solitude. Solitude is just time together with yourself. It can be great. Arendt believed that solitude was the gateway to individual and creative thought. Loneliness, on the other hand, is not only feeling disconnected from others, but also from yourself. And when you're surrounded by people at the same time, it's worse because there's no opportunity for solitude. Here's another quote from the book that I find really interesting. When loneliness occurs, man loses trust in himself as a partner of his thoughts. When people feel disconnected from others, when they lack support and validation, they may begin to lose confidence in their own beliefs and judgments. This creates a void that other ideologies can fill, that authoritarian regimes can exploit. Only when the most elemental form of human creativity, which is the capacity to add something of one's own to the common world, is destroyed, isolation becomes altogether unbearable. I can definitely relate to this on some level. Now, I'm fine. This is not a life or death situation, but I do have bad days occasionally where I struggle with finding purpose and meaning. Why am I doing this? Am I really adding something of value to the world? Does anything I do actually matter? Etc. And if that's how I felt every day, that would suck. It'd be a miserable, lonely existence. And I'd probably be desperate for a way to feel relevant again. I might even be tempted to support a bold and charismatic leader who promises to fight for me and restore my sense of greatness. What, you don't think you're susceptible? Well, here's a hypothetical situation for you. Imagine feeling like you have nothing left to contribute. You feel lost, ignored, abandoned, superfluous. Then imagine an individual comes along, someone powerful and respected, who sees your struggle, knows what you've been going through, and promises to fight for you and restore your sense of purpose and place. Maybe it's even someone famous that you already feel like you know and trust. No, not that guy. What if it was someone more like this? Or this? Sure, they might be a little rough around the edges, but don't you want someone like that on your side? Someone who's got your back. Someone who shoots first sometimes, and isn't afraid to talk tough and speak the truth. And in return for your loyalty, you could be part of something greater than yourself. You can have a purpose and place in the world again. My point is, this is how a lot of people see Trump. Not as a politician, but as a folk hero. Sure, he's not perfect, and he's kind of a huge asshole, but if his heart's in the right place, does it really matter? Trump's message to his supporters is simple. I see your pain, it's those other guys' fault, you deserve greatness, and with a snap of my fingers, I can restore everything to its rightful place. It's a powerful message. It's complete bullshit, of course, but it works. It's basically a Cinderella story on a massive scale. I mean, who doesn't want to be Cinderella, right? Plucked from obscurity, elevated to greatness, and then tell your oppressors to go shove it. The problem is that the greatness never comes, promises are broken, authoritarians will never admit fault, of course, they'll just blame someone else. It's basically like a cheat code for controlling people. Find a group of people that feel disconnected, identify their loss, and then tell them what they want to hear. In the mid-20th century, Hannah Arendt saw loneliness as a dangerous prerequisite for authoritarianism. And now, decades later, we finally have the studies to back this up. In her more recent work, Dr. Golek de Zavala found a clear link between low self-esteem and collective narcissism. In these studies, she defines self-esteem as the belief that one is able to influence the course of their own life, which, if you negate it, sounds a lot like Hannah Arendt's loneliness. What these studies found was that low self-esteem predicts outgroup derogation by way of collective narcissism, meaning that if you have low self-esteem and you attempt to compensate for that by finding greatness in a group that you belong to, then you are more likely to engage in negativity and hostility towards outside groups in an attempt to boost your self-esteem. The tragic part is, this self-esteem boost never arrives. Studies over time have found that while low self-esteem predicts collective narcissism weeks later, engaging in collective narcissism does not predict an increase in self-esteem. This leads to a vicious cycle. Vicious! Instead of trying to boost their self-esteem elsewhere, people double down. They become further entrenched in their group, and they become increasingly hostile towards outsiders. Turns out, being an aggressive d***hole is not an effective way to boost your self-esteem. Who knew? Collective narcissism is, for some people, an attempt to restore their self-worth. But it's an effort that's destined to fail. It's a losing strategy that only increases their feelings of loneliness and isolation, and thus deepening their dependency on the group. But I don't know. Maybe making the claim that loneliness is responsible for the rise in authoritarianism is a bit of a stretch. I mean, it's not like we're experiencing epidemic levels of loneliness right now, right? Right? We are really lonely right now. According to a 2019 loneliness report from Cigna of over 10,000 adults in the US, 52% of people surveyed reported feeling sometimes or always alone. In addition, nearly half of respondents reported sometimes or always feeling isolated from others, that their relationships are not meaningful, and that they no longer feel close to anyone. And this is all taken from survey data before COVID. And the problem is worse the younger you are. Gen Z is currently the loneliest generation. So why are we so freaking lonely right now? There's no conclusive answer to this question, but I did come across a lot of possible explanations for the rise in authoritarianism, and if you look at these from a loneliness perspective, it starts to make a lot of sense. There's income inequality. The more separated the classes are, the more the lower class feels isolated and powerless. There's globalism, demographic changes, random and sporadic terrorist attacks, and the one that I think might be the biggest contributor at the moment, cultural backlash. It's the idea that when traditionally marginalized groups like ethnic minorities or LGBTQ people see an improvement in their social status, the previously dominant group experiences a relative loss in status, and there's a resultant backlash. The cultural backlash theory seems particularly relevant now, given the extensive amount of new anti-trans laws in state governments, not to mention the uptick in anti-gay rhetoric. Collective narcissism is also associated with something psychologists call a quest for personal significance. On an extreme end, this means the use of violence and terrorism out of a desire to matter, to be someone on a collective level. That's the real objective. A quest for personal significance among a toxic stew of radical ideologies and endemic levels of loneliness. Now, what does that remind me of? Social media. From filter bubbles, to echo chambers, to fake news, to algorithms steering viewers towards more and more extreme content. YouTube. Social media has certainly been under a lot of scrutiny over the past few years for the destabilizing effect it has on politics and democracy. And the problems go well beyond news and media consumption. Now, social media can be very useful for making new connections and finding community, particularly for people and groups who have been socially marginalized. Keeping up with distant friends and relatives, building your personal brand, and checking out some of the latest fails can possibly add value to your life. But social media is also as addictive as by design. And if your social media consumption is limiting your real-life person-to-person interactions, you're probably suffering as a result. A 2017 study in the American Journal of Preventative Medicine found that people who are on social media most frequently, defined as 50 or more visits per week, were 3 times as likely to feel socially isolated than those who are on social media fewer than 9 times per week. Mood disorders and the rates of death by suicide rose dramatically between the mid-2000s and late teens, primarily driven by increases among adolescents and adults aged 18 to 25. This suggests that cultural trends within the past 10 years may have played a role. During that same period, social media was emerging from its infancy as a quaint internet novelty when a bunch of us were friends with this guy for some reason, to the world-changing, information-harvesting, life-consuming threat to democracy that it is today. As of writing this, Facebook has over 2 billion daily users. The average daily social media usage worldwide is 2 hours and 27 minutes, and Americans, on average, check their mobile devices 159 times per day. My point is we use social media a lot, okay? While there's no definitive proof, there is a growing body of evidence that suggests that social media consumption is connected to the increase in mental health problems that we've been experiencing. For example, the rate of depression and self-harm among adolescents had a sudden increase after 2012, right around the time that smartphone usage was becoming widespread. Now, I know correlation does not equal causation, but I mean, come on, look at that. Numerous studies have found that heavy users of digital media are more likely to be unhappy, depressed, or have risk factors for suicide. Social media gives the feeling of being connected and being part of a community, and does offer some benefit, but the heavy use is exacting a toll on our collective psyche, and probably taking crucial time away from traditional human ways of connecting. You know, faces looking at other faces, shared laughter, hugs, group high fives, doing the electric slide, whatever this move is. Social media platforms and the people who control them are not evil necessarily, maybe just greedy, naive, and grossly incompetent, but they do provide the optimal environment for authoritarian movements to spread, while at the same time priming their users to be more susceptible by isolating them and lowering their self-esteem. So, are we in the midst of a self-esteem crisis? caused by social media that is pushing people towards authoritarianism? Is the world order being rocked by a backlash against a shift towards more liberal values? Do people feel left behind by demographic changes, the excesses of globalism, income inequality? Do we just have too many streaming services right now? Hard to say. Maybe a little of everything? One thing is for certain though. People are profoundly unhappy and lost, and democracy and civility are on the decline in much of the developed world. So, what can we do about it? Anything? Nothing? Are we screwed? Despite all the negative stuff I've been talking about for the past half hour, I'm still pretty optimistic about the survival of democracy. Survival in the long run, that is. Survival of democracy in the US? I give it about 50-50. The good news is that the same studies that looked at the connection between collective narcissism and hostility actually point to a couple of possible solutions. While derogating outgroups is not an effective strategy for improving self-esteem, what is an effective strategy is improving in-group satisfaction. In-group satisfaction is kind of like collective narcissism's more successful and well-adjusted sibling. In-group satisfaction is simply the belief that the in-group is of high value. Now, at first, this may sound similar to collective narcissism, and it is, in a way, but there's an important distinction. Outwardly, they both express a belief in the high value of their group. But for collective narcissists, this positive image is excessive, difficult to sustain, and requires constant external validation. In-group satisfaction doesn't have this problem. Satisfaction in this case means just that. You're satisfied with your group's status, and you're satisfied with your own place within that group. Therefore, you're less likely to seek external validation and less likely to act out with anger and hostility if you don't get it. So the good news is that improving in-group satisfaction may be a path towards a more peaceful coexistence with outgroups. So how do we do this in practice? I have no idea. But I think it's an idea worth exploring. Studies have also been done on the positive effects of gratitude. In one experiment in Poland, participants who listened to a 10-minute long guided mindful gratitude meditation were twice less likely to have negative attitudes towards Jews than the control group. So there's that. Another possible way to diffuse tensions between two opposing groups is to emphasize a shared superordinate identity, like a more complex multinational identity that doesn't emphasize one group over the other, or to give a sports example, like emphasizing the NFL as a collection of many great teams versus individual teams just emphasizing their own greatness. I'm looking at you, New England Patriots. Why couldn't you be more like the '85 Bears? They didn't come to start no trouble. They just came to do the Super Bowl shuffle. There's also been a lot written about the need to revitalize local news, specifically print news, as sort of an antidote for people just getting their news on the internet, which can be problematic sometimes, as we have discussed. Local news has the benefit of helping people feel more connected to their communities versus getting lost in sensationalized national news stories, which we have no control over, are less likely to affect us directly, and basically just get us worked up and pissed off at each other. And on the loneliness front, this past May, the US Surgeon General released a health advisory warning of the dangers of loneliness and isolation. It proposes a national strategy to advance social connection, which includes strengthening social infrastructure in local communities and reforming digital environments. Now, at the moment, these are all just suggestions and not actual policy, but an official health advisory from the US Surgeon General at least feels like a step in the right direction. Regulating social media and reducing income inequality probably can't hurt either, but that feels like a topic for a different video. So, how does this all end? The problems with authoritarianism and collective narcissism can't be easily fixed with a couple new laws or by prosecuting every reality television star that decides to become president and subvert our democracy for personal gain. It's in our DNA. It's a bug in our programming. People are always going to be susceptible to certain types of personalities, narratives, and group dynamics. It's possible, though I'm really hoping this is not the case, that humanity needs to hit rock bottom before we could dig ourselves out, and that this is not rock bottom, like things could get a lot worse. Like the global shock experienced after World War II when the full scope of the atrocities was revealed. Countries of the world were all like, nope, never again, and we created the United Nations and bound ourselves to treaties, like a powerful global immune response. But like many immune responses, it doesn't last forever. This is not the chicken pox. It's more like COVID. We'll get to that later. My grandfather was a World War II vet, and he died a couple years ago at the age of 99. The survivors that lived through World War II fascism are not going to be around much longer. Is it any wonder then that authoritarianism is rising across the globe just as their collective memory is fading? Is the fall and rise of authoritarianism just a generational thing, something that humanity will periodically struggle with as long as we're around on this planet? If that's the case, then maybe the preppers have the right idea. However, this wave-like nature of authoritarianism does give me hope by way of a different analogy. About 3 years ago, I made a video about how violence is like a contagious disease that spreads from person to person in predictable wave-like and cluster patterns, and that it should be treated in much the same way that healthcare workers treat epidemics. Maybe the rise of authoritarianism is analogous to the spread of contagious disease as well. The waves of the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, could be representative of the rise and fall of authoritarianism throughout our history. Maybe this huge spike here is like the rise of 1930s fascism. Here's this brand new contagion. Human beings have never experienced anything quite like it before, caught us totally off guard, and it raged through a huge segment of our population. But this big wave of COVID, while incredibly deadly, left us with a measure of immunity, and we have great vaccines now, part of the reason why subsequent waves have been less severe. Likewise, we now know what to look for to determine if democracies are backsliding into authoritarianism, and hopefully we're better equipped to deal with it this time before it gets out of control. Another reason why COVID isn't as deadly now as this first huge wave is because the disease itself has changed. So has authoritarianism. These days, in order for authoritarianism to spread, it has disguised itself as democracy, adopting some democratic features in order to slip past our defenses. It mutated. And as a result, it's not quite as deadly this time around. So if we can't stop it, maybe the next best thing is to flatten the curve, slow the spread, buy ourselves the time we need to vote out these shitty politicians and reverse some of these toxic social trends. One difficult but important lesson I learned over the past 7 or so years is that if you're having a debate with someone from the opposite political tribe, whether they're liberal or conservative, a well-crafted argument using facts and logic is never going to convert a true believer. It's because for many of these people, myself included sometimes, the problem isn't lack of knowledge. Group loyalty always trumps reason. I wish I didn't have to use that word. And the most ardent supporters of these groups are often pushed there by low self-esteem and collective narcissism. People don't fervently cling to hostile ideologies because of some deeply held moral conviction. They cling to these ideas because they're lost and confused and unable to face the root cause of their suffering. So we should feel bad for them. Instead of getting pissed off, we need to be helping these people. So that's how I feel about it, at least. The world is waking up to the rising dangers of authoritarianism. A lot of really smart people are devoting their time and intellect to this problem, and they're talking about it a lot in books and articles and podcasts, and this gives me some hope, at least. If the whole world turns into the Hunger Games in a couple of years, we can't say we didn't see it coming. There's one final idea that I'll leave you with that I thought was really interesting, but didn't really have time to explore in this video. It's the idea that with every major breakthrough in communications technology, there will follow, as a side effect, some period of societal disruption. This happened in the past with the invention and wide-scale use of the printing press, and later with radio and television. And it's happening again now. It took a few decades, but we're finally aware, at least, of the threat to democracy posed by the internet and social media. We haven't fixed these problems yet, but in theory, this period of disruption is a phase that will eventually pass once humanity has adapted to the new technology and we strike some sort of balance. And then it should be smooth sailing. That is, of course, until the next major breakthrough in communications technology, but that's like years from now, right? Ah, crap. Thank you for watching my video on collective narcissism and authoritarianism. I'd love to hear what you all think, so if you have any comments, questions, concerns, as you should, leave them in the comments section. I might be doing a follow-up video at some point to address certain things that have changed since I started on this project. I've been working on this video for over 2 years now, and a lot has changed in that time. A lot has changed in the past 2 weeks, but I think the stuff that I talk about in this video is just as relevant today as it was when I started over 2 years ago, if not more so. It's something that's really important to me, something I'm really concerned about. So hopefully you found this video interesting or stimulating. This is also the first video that I've uploaded to my new personal YouTube channel. I hope to be making more content similar to this. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, feel free to subscribe. I also have a mailing list in the description if you want to sign up for that. I promise I won't spam you. Thanks again for watching. Until next time. I need a sign off. I don't know what my sign off's going to be. Leave a comment if you have a suggestion. Bye. See ya.